Wilbur Wright was born April 16th, 1867. Orville Wright would follow 4 years later on August 19th of 1871. Their father was Milton Wright, who was a bishop of the Church of United Brethren of Christ. Mother, Susan Catherine Wright, she would give birth to 7 children, but only 5 survived past infancy. The Wright family would move around a lot until finally growing roots on 7th Hawthorne Street, Dayton, Ohio. The family would move to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then Richmond, Indiana, before moving back to the Dayton home in 1884. Fun fact, none of the Wrights' children had middle names. Their father, Milton, would pick out distinctive, different first names to make his kids' names seem special in their own way. Also, because Milton was a bishop, the boys would oftentimes get nicknamed the Bishop Boys. Anyway, Susan, the mother, was mechanically inclined, and she would make a sled for her kids, as well as make custom appliances of her very own. She would encourage her kids to get involved in trades like mechanics, carpentry, plumbing, etc. One day, Milton came home with a toy propeller. This toy would be the spark that ignited the powder keg, so to speak, in both Wilbur and Orville. It was that toy that gave them the inspiration to fly. The toy was made of paper and bamboo with cork, twin blades which ran off of a twisted rubber band. The toy was introduced to Orville when he was about 7 years old, and Wilbur was around 11 years old. The year was 1878. Both Wilbur and Orville went to high school, but they both did not finish, so they're high school dropouts. Side note, did you ever stop and wonder if there was a link between doing poor in school but doing great in the real world? Just think about it. How many people dropped out of high school? Or maybe they didn't drop out of high school. Maybe they were just terrible at high school, but they rocked it in the real world. It's just an interesting connection. Wilbur did get his diploma, though, on April 16th of 1994 on what would have been his 127th birthday. Wilbur Wright was very athletic, very active, until getting struck in the head with a hockey stick, resulting in the loss of his front teeth. Ironically, the person that hit Wilbur would later become a serial killer. His name was Oliver Cook Haw. After losing his front teeth after getting clocked in the head with a hockey stick, Wilbur became withdrawn from society. He lost all confidence in himself, and he's kind of embarrassed because he's missing his teeth. Wilbur would stay at home, and while at home, Wilbur took care of his mother, who was terminally ill with the TB. Tuberculosis. Orville Wright would drop out of high school his junior year to begin a print shop. Wilbur would go with him. The two would get into the printing business in 1889 with a printing press of their very own design. The brothers would even have their own weekly newspaper called the West Side News, with Orville as publisher and Wilbur as editor. In 1890, they would try to do a daily paper and rename their paper the Evening Item. Catchy, right? People back then didn't think so either. And it only lasted 4 months until primary focus shifted onto bigger and better prospects, like commercial printing. As time progressed, the business would grow, and they would move from their tiny carriage barn to a nearby office building on West 3rd Street. Together, Wilbur and Orville built a second, larger press capable of printing 500 to 1,000 sheets per hour. Its construction was ingenious, so much so that it caught the attention of professional printers. Just like all of the convoluted stories, there's a lot at play here. In the background, going back to about 1881, Wilbur would buy his first bicycle, and sources conflict on the exact date. Hey, it was a long time ago, and things just blend together over time. They probably forgot the exact year. It was the high wheeler variety for $3. Both Wilbur and Orville would fall into the bicycle craze. Faster and easier than walking, Orville would buy a brand new Columbia, which was made by Pope for $160. For those that don't know, Pope was the largest bicycle manufacturing company here in the United States for a time. Wilbur would get something a little bit more practical than the high wheeler. He would get a second-hand Eagle for $80. Both Orville and Wilbur liked to go on cross-country cycling runs, and it's exactly what you would think it would be. It's cross-country. The roads sucked back then. There was only like 12 miles of paved road in all of Dayton, Ohio. Orville would also race bicycles from time to time. One interesting prize that he would win was a rocking chair at the Montgomery Fair. Wright Cycle Exchange was their first bicycle repair shop in Dayton, Ohio, established in 1892. They were a full-service bicycle repair shop. They sold parts, they sold bicycles, brands included but not limited to Fleetwig, Redding, Coventry Cross, Warlick, Duchess. Prices ranged anywhere from $40 to $100, and if you wasn't ready to buy, they would also rent you a bike. On April 16th of 1896, the Wrights would build their own line of bicycles called the Van Cleve and St. Clair. The name Van Cleve was chosen as a family heritage name. They were essentially assembled bikes, sourcing parts from various manufacturers like the seats, the cranks, frames, handlebars, all from bigger manufacturing companies that made various bicycle parts, which included Davis Sewing Machine Company. The Wrights, when they launched their quote-unquote own bicycle line, they had 4 years in bicycle repair business, so the Wrights knew what parts to look for, what parts were good, what parts were not as good. Fun fact, the safety bike was introduced in 1876 by Harry John Lawson, but it didn't take off like wildfire until 1885, nearly 10 years later. The Van Cleve was a pretty advanced bike for its day, with double diamond frame, horizontal crossbar, that put the rider directly over the pedals. The wheel hub bearings were adjustable by screwing the inner bearing caps in or out of the hub. The advantage was the wheels could be removed without changing the adjustment in bearings. The seats also telescoped so the rider could adjust their seating position, getting their knees at the proper angle onto the pedals. Van Cleve featured 28-inch wheels to ensure that it could go over bumps and terrain. The hubs also hold oil. The Wrights were always improving their designs. By 1900, the Van Cleve, though the same name, was a completely different bike. The Wrights bicycles were customized to fit the needs, wants, and desires of their customers. 1900, the Wrights also featured coaster brakes, the kind where you backpedal and the motion results in rear brakes being applied. People oftentimes forget or don't realize the impact that bicycles had. I was once called, personally, in the comment section, an idiot or a moron. I can't remember exactly what the right terminology was, related to John North Willis making $500,000 in 1 year by selling bicycles. Everybody and their mom wanted in on the bicycle craze. Bicycle shops started popping up everywhere to the point that the market was oversaturated. Compounded by larger companies buying up the competition, bigger companies could make bicycles cheaper, eliminating competition that way as well. The Wrights addressed those issues in their 1900 catalog. The Wrights felt that their bikes were still or could remain competitive because their bicycles were custom and made to order. The bicycle venture was great in the beginning for the Wright brothers. Both brothers made about $1,500 each in 1897, which was their best year. The brothers would operate both the print shop and the bicycle business for a time. But while all of that was going on, remember back to the propeller top that their father Milton gave to them? The idea of self-propeller flight never left the Wrights. Together, with $5,000 saved up, they would begin aviation experiments. The Wrights' first aviation experiment that was documented was conducted in 1899 with a kite with a wingspan of 5 feet, built of pine wood and shellacked. The kite wasn't big enough to support a person riding on top or strapped to the underside. The kite was built to witness the effects of wing warping, which was an early control of lateral roll. The system consisted of pulleys, cables to twist trailing edges of the wings in opposite directions. The technique was used and patented by the Wright brothers. Wing warping would turn out to be the missing link to controlled flight. Meanwhile, back at the print shop, they hired a man by the name of Ed Sines to do the day-to-day stuff. He was like the only thing keeping that place running. He proved it the day he quit. With bigger and better fish to fry, the Wrights would take that opportunity to get out of the print business and they would put that money to good use. After catching wind on what was supposed to be kept a secret, then Assistant Secretary to the Navy Theodore Roosevelt convinced the War Department to pay Secretary of the Smithsonian Samuel Langley $50,000, which would be equivalent to $1.9 million to build and develop a man-carrying flying machine called the Aerodrome. The amount of money got the Wrights' attention, as it was the largest sum of money that the government ever paid up until that point in time. After seeing the design, the Wrights knew the design could be improved upon. Langley's Aerodrome didn't have the necessary controls to achieve flight, even though at this point in time, the Wrights haven't flown themselves, but they will set out and be the first ones to do it. In 1900, the Wrights would build their first glider, which was able to carry a human being. The Wrights flyer was based off of a design of Octave Chanute, what a name, 1896, two-surface glider. Octave Chanute was a French-American Civil War engineer and aviation pioneer, hailed as one of the fathers of aviation, also a pioneer in other medias. He created pressure-treated wood, which was used for railway ties. After reading Progress in Flying Machines, Wilbur Wright would contact Chanute. The two would collaborate on various flying experiments. Chanute would help the Wright brothers publicize their work and findings. Chanute would also encourage the brothers to visit their camp near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Chanute shared his knowledge about aviation with everybody and anybody that wanted to learn it, and expected others to follow suit, which caused a bit of contention with the Wrights with their wing warping patent technique, saying in an interview the Wrights were wasting their time over lawsuits and they should focus on their work. The 1900 Wright glider had a wingspan of 17.5 feet, wing area of 155 square feet, trussed like a bridge weighing 52 pounds, elevator in the front, which Orville believed to be the saving grace against nosediving, which saw the sudden end to many aviation pioneers. That glider was first flown as an unmanned kite on October 5th of 1900, and then Wilbur piloted it with ropes attached to keep the craft somewhat grounded. In 1901, the brothers would build an all-new glider. They would test this one 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk over Kill Devil Hills. The 1901 glider was a completely different design with larger wings. The 1901 glider would take flight on July 27th of 1901, and it would make between 50 to 100 free flights before retiring the glider in August of that year. The new glider had a wingspan of 22 feet, wing area of 290 square feet, and it was almost double the weight at 98 pounds. In the fall of 1901, the Wrights were finding inconsistencies on what they thought to be bulletproof aviation principles, bringing everything that they thought they knew about aviation into question. Despite being able to fly the glider at heights around 300 feet, lift and drag were two principles that wasn't all that well known. To try to understand these concepts, the Wrights would turn their bicycle shop into a wind tunnel testing studio. The wind tunnel was a simple open return design with a fan pushing a flow of air through an enclosed square box and then exiting into the room. Wind tunnel tests were conducted from September to December of 1901, and at the conclusion of the test, the brothers had most detailed data in the world as far as design for aircraft wings. They used this data to design the 1902 aircraft, which overcame the problems encountered in 1900 and 1901. They also used the data in the design of their propellers for the 1903 aircraft. The 1902 glider was the Wrights' third glider, and it was the first aircraft in the world with 3-axis aerodynamic control. That is, it could be made to pitch, roll, and yaw in flight. The forward elevator pitched the nose of the glider up and down around its lateral axis. The wing warping rolled the wings of the glider around its longitude axis, and the rear rudder yawed the nose right or left around the vertical axis. This was the basis for the Wrights' Pioneer flying machine patented in 1906. With a wingspan of 32 feet, 305 square feet wing area, the craft weighed 112 pounds. The Wrights would go back to Kitty Hawk with their third glider, almost flying it 1,000 times during September and October of 1902, making flights that stretched up to 622 feet and last as long as 26 seconds. They stored the glider at Kitty Hawk over the winter, and then they used it again in 1903 to hone their flying skills. They made another 1,000 flights between September and November of 1903, one of which lasted 43 seconds. Pleased with the 1902 glider, the Wrights would use what they learned from the past three gliders to build an engine-powered one that might be able to stay in the air for longer. But looking around at all the different engines that were on offer, the Wrights didn't find one that would fit the bill. They needed an engine that would produce about 8 horsepower and was no heavier than 200 pounds. No such engine in 1903 existed. So they would commission Charlie Taylor, who was already employed by the Wrights, to build such an engine. The engine that powered Flyer 1 was a 201 cubic inch displacement inline 4. It was good for anywhere between 12 to 16 horsepower. It made 16 horsepower initially, and then when it heated up, it only made 12 horsepower, and it made that power at 1,025 RPM. It was a square engine with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 4 inches. 92% of the block was made of cast aluminum with 8% copper. Single gallon gas tank. Actually, it was like 22 ounces of gas tank, which was suspended from the wing strut. Gasoline was delivered to the engine by gravity. No traditional carburetor was used. The gasoline was fed into a tiny chamber in the manifold. No spark plugs were used in this engine as well, but it did have spark by opening and closing contact points inside the combustion chamber. This engine weighed 180 pounds. It took Charlie 6 weeks to design and build this engine. The engine was mounted on its side with pistons going the same way. Dry batteries were used to start the engine, but then it ran on magneto. No batteries were on the Flyer itself. Another interesting tidbit is the engine had no throttle control, so the engine was always running at full tilt, lubricated by splash. The engine was first tested on February 12th of 1903, and it performed great, making 16 horsepower initially on the test run. The next day, the engine overheated and seized up on the test bench. So a whole new engine had to be built, but it was ready to go by June. The Wright brothers would return to Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills in December of 1903, where they would assemble the Flyer, getting it ready for their first attempt at powered flight, which would happen on December 14th. The Wrights flipped a coin to decide who was going to pilot the Flyer. Was it going to be Wilbur or was it going to be Orville? Wilbur would win the coin toss. The Flyer was positioned to make a gravity-assisted takeoff. Wilbur made a miscalculation by pulling up too sharply, which stalled the engine and came down after only covering 105 feet. It was only in the air for 3.5 seconds. Predictably, when the craft met the ground, it took on damage, which took a couple days to fix it. On December 17th, Orville would get his chance to pilot the craft. With wind speed of 20 miles per hour, the brothers went for a level takeoff, laying the launching rail level on the ground, and would take off into the wind. Orville's flight lasted 12 seconds, covering a distance of 120 feet. The brothers would take turns, making 4 flights that day. Wilbur finishing out the day with the longest flight of 852 feet in 59 seconds. It's important to note that these flights were straight-line flights. Turning wasn't attempted. The 4th flight ended with a sudden landing resulting in damage to the front elevator, which the Wrights could fix, but while it was on the ground, a heavy gust of wind picked up the Flyer, tumbling it end over end, and it would never fly again. The Wrights would build an all-new Flyer called the Flyer 2, and it would be tested at Huffman Prairie, which was a cow pasture just outside of Dayton, Ohio. The new Flyer weighed 200 pounds heavier than the 1903 Flyer, and it was powered by a 15 horsepower 4-cylinder. At the end of May, the press was invited to come and behold this flying machine, a spectacle that you don't want to miss. You got to see this with your very own eyes. A crowd of 40 people would gather, But the weather wasn't cooperating. It rained, and the flyer stayed under cover until the rain subsided. But when the rain quit, the wind also quit, which wasn't a good thing for because the Wrights knew without a headwind, getting off the ground wasn't going to be successful. But not wanting to disappoint the press, the Wrights would make an attempt to get airborne. The weather took a turn for the worst, and they were also having engine problems, which delayed further attempts until Thursday afternoon, when, despite an ignition problem, takeoff was attempted. The flight was only around 25 feet, and it made with a heavy landing, which damaged the aircraft. The Chicago Tribune ran a story under the headline, "Test of Flying Machine is Judged a Success," while the New York Times headline was, "Fall Wrecks Airship." I guess some things really do never change. Repairs took 2 weeks, but the next flight also ended in a crash, necessitating a further 2 weeks of repair work. On June 21st, 3 flights were made without any breakages. But 4 days hence, the flyer would crash again. These accidents were caused by the aircraft's pitch. It was thought to believe that the center of gravity was too far forward, so they moved the engine back as well as the pilot position, but this made everything worse. Instead of flying in a straight line, the aircraft was very wavy. 70 pounds of ballast was added under the elevator in form of iron bars, which did the trick. The Wrights would make 105 flights that year, with the longest being piloted by Wilbur, where he circled Huffman Prairie 4 times, being in the air for 5 minutes, 8 seconds, covering a distance of 3 miles. The Wrights would make a stronger, more robust flyer in 1905 called the Flyer 3. It looked very similar to the flyers that came before it. Orville was piloting the craft on July 14th of 1905 when the craft took a sudden nosedive, crashing. Orville survived the crash with minor injuries. When rebuilding the craft, modifications were made to the elevator and rudder, which doubled in size, and they were moved further from the wings. They also disconnected the rear rudder from wing warping control, making them 2 separate controls. A larger fuel tank was added, along with 2 radiators for extra cooling. Testing resumed in September of 1905. With these modifications, flight was proved successful. They didn't have the pitching problems and was able to control the craft easier and stay in the air longer, with flights lasting over 20 minutes. On October 5th of 1905, Wilbur circled over Huffman Prairie, which lasted 39 minutes, 23 seconds, covering a distance of 24.2 miles, which was longer in duration than all of the flights in 1903 and 1904 combined. The Wrights wanted to sell what they learned about flying to the United States government. The Wrights would stop flying on November 5th of 1905, disassembling the aircraft to try to protect their findings on flying. But by 1903, they kind of had a change of heart. The Wrights would reassemble the Flyer 3. They had it shipped to Kitty Hawk, where they took their mechanic, Charles Furness, for a ride. Wilbur would crash that craft later that day. The Wrights would leave it there, taking only the engine back to Dayton, Ohio. The Flyer 3 would lead to the Model A, which was the world's first production airplane. The Wrights would build many different versions of the Model A from 1907 through 1909. Similar in design to the Flyer 3, but longer and heavier with a more powerful engine, and was also equipped with 2 seats that sat upright, which were placed on the leading edge of the wing. Both Wilbur and Orville did flight tests all over the world to show the promise of this technology. The United States Army would purchase its first aircraft from the Wright brothers in August of 1909. After the brothers demonstrated the airplane, all of the conditions that had been set out for a heavier-than-air flying machine that was issued back in December of 1907, the Wrights first brought a Wright Model A airplane to Fort Myer, Virginia for testing on August 20th of 1908. After a series of successful flights, the airplane crashed on September 17th of 1908, severely injuring Orville, but killing his passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. Despite the tragedy, the Army was convinced that the Wrights had built a capable airplane and extended their contract for 1 year. With the government's involvement, the Wright brothers would found the Wright Company, which was a commercial aviation business venture of the Wright brothers. They established it on November 22nd of 1909. It's important to note that this was a joint venture between the Wright brothers and industrialists from New York and Detroit, also with some big power players like J.P. Morgan and Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Wright Company was founded with a capitalization of $1 million. Wilbur and Orville would get $100,000 plus a third of the shares of stock in the company with the intention of capitalizing on their invention of making a practical airplane. The Wright brothers would modify the Model A design for the military, making the wingspan just a wee bit smaller, and would return on June 29th, 1909 for testing. Both Wilbur and Orville were present, but Orville did all of the flying. On July 30th of 1909, Orville flew for the last test. It was the speed test with Lieutenant Benjamin D. Foyas as passenger. The aircraft averaged a speed of 42.58 miles per hour and a flight distance of over 44 miles. With these results, the United States Army agreed to pay the Wright brothers $25,000 for the Wright military flyer, with a bonus of $2,500 for each mile over 40 miles per hour. So they got a lump sum of $30,000 in 1909, which would be equivalent to over $1 million in the year 2025. Also, in the fall of 1909, the Wrights would start training student pilots and military pilots. The Model A would lead to the Model B, which was their most successful aircraft. It was designed drastically different than the Model A. It did not have an elevator in the front. The headless Wright. It was produced from 1910 through 1914. While all of that was going on, the Wrights would sue various other early aviators for patent infringement, but by the winter of 1911, the Wrights, as well as other American airline companies, would lose their technological edge to the Europeans, with the main reason being their government's involvement with aerotech. Here in the States, it wasn't like the European countries like Germany, France, and England, whose governments were buying aircraft, supporting aviation research. Wilbur and Orville were the researchers, and they were too busy going after people suing for patent infringement. It's kind of harking back to what Chanute said years prior. Wilbur would work himself to the brink of death going after these patent suits, and because he didn't rest and take care of himself, take time out to recharge, he was pretty much burnt out by the spring of 1912. Wilbur would get typhoid fever, a disease caused by Salmonella typhini bacteria. Symptoms can range from mild to severe, but since Wilbur wasn't in the best shape when he got infected, Wilbur would get better, but then it got worse, and the disease would ultimately take his life on May 30th, 1912. Wilbur was only 45 years old when he perished. Wilbur's father, Milton, who was still alive at Wilbur's passing, wrote in Wilbur's diary, "A short life full of consequences, an unfailing intellect, imperturbable temper, great self-reliance, and great modesty, seeing the right clearly, preserving it steadfastly, he lived and died." Orville would become president of the Wright Company after Wilbur's death, and not wanting to go down the same road as his brother Wilbur with the stress of the legal battles, Orville was more into innovation, and he wasn't really into the aviation business side of things. So in 1915, Orville would sell the Wright Company with all of its patents to a group of investors in New York for $250,000, which would be equivalent to $7.9 million in the year 2025. The New York investors would then merge it with Martin, becoming Wright-Martin in 1916. In 1919, it would be reorganized as the Wright Aeronautical, which only lasted until 1929, and then it merged with Curtiss to become Curtiss-Wright. Orville would live a long life, dying on January 30th of 1948 of a heart attack, actually the second heart attack that he ever had, having seen a lot in his life, from bicycles to airplanes. If you've made it this far, all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching this one. This one's a bit outside the box than what we normally do on here, But I wanted to tell you there's so much more to this story, but the story would be like 4 days long if I covered every single piece of information that I found. I got a lot of this information from the wrightbrothers.org. So if you want to explore this topic more in depth, I will leave the link in the description below, because the internet outside of that website doesn't know the Wright brothers. And they even make a point to say it on that website, which I find very interesting. But thank you all so much for watching this one. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of the comment section. Thanks again for everything that you guys bring in the community. And until next time, toodaloo! And to think, this episode stemmed from an engine episode, for an engine thought. Who would have knew there was so much history to be discovered?